Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls growing up in rural Montana. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or talking about boys, she was out in the wilderness with her grandfather, learning to track deer and understanding the delicate mechanics of firearms. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her that respect for weapons came through understanding them completely. At 24, Sarah found herself working as a civilian contractor at Fort Braxton, one of the largest military training facilities in the western United States. Her official title was Weapons Maintenance Specialist, but everyone on base simply called her the mechanic. She spent her days in the armory, carefully disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling everything from standard-issue rifles to specialized sniper weapons used by elite units. The work suited her perfectly. Sarah had an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems with firearms just by listening to them fire or feeling their action when cycling rounds. Soldiers would bring her weapons that other technicians had declared beyond repair, and somehow she would find the tiny worn spring or the slightly bent firing pin that was causing the malfunction. Her workspace was a testament to her meticulous nature. Tools hung in perfect order on pegboards, each one cleaned and returned to its exact place after use. Parts bins were labeled with her neat handwriting, and her workbench was spotless despite the constant stream of dirty, battle-worn weapons that crossed it daily. The armory was located in the heart of the base, surrounded by training facilities where soldiers honed their marksmanship skills. Sarah could hear the constant pop of gunfire throughout her workday, but she rarely ventured out to the ranges herself. Her job was to ensure the weapons worked perfectly. Someone else's job was to use them. Most of the soldiers who interacted with Sarah were respectful and professional. They appreciated her skill and the fact that weapons returned from her bench performed flawlessly. However, there was one group that seemed to view her with a mixture of amusement and dismissal: the elite sniper unit known as Falcon Team. Falcon Team consisted of 6 highly trained marksmen who specialized in long-range precision shooting. They were the best of the best, capable of hitting targets at distances that most people would consider impossible. Their leader was Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, a decorated veteran with over 100 confirmed kills in combat zones around the world. Chen was undeniably skilled, but he was also arrogant. He had a habit of making casual comments about civilians who played with guns without understanding what real shooting was about. When he brought his custom rifle to Sarah for maintenance, he would often linger in the armory, making subtle jokes about her work or questioning whether she truly understood the weapons she repaired. "You know," he said one afternoon, watching her carefully clean the bolt of his rifle, "there's a big difference between making these things work and actually knowing how to use them. Anyone can turn a wrench, but it takes real skill to put rounds on target when it matters." Sarah continued her work without looking up. She had heard variations of this speech many times before. "I'm sure it does," she replied evenly, using a dental pick to remove carbon buildup from the bolt face. Chen leaned against her workbench, clearly enjoying himself. "I mean, don't get me wrong, what you do is important. We need people to keep our equipment running. It's just that there's a whole other level to this game that most people never get to experience." Other members of Falcon Team had joined him now, drawn by the familiar sound of their leader holding court. They stood in a loose semicircle around Sarah's workbench, all of them still wearing their camouflage fatigues from whatever training exercise they had just completed. "Chen's being modest," said Sergeant Williams, a lanky man from Texas with a prominent Adam's apple. "He can put 3 rounds through the same hole at 800 meters. That's not luck, that's pure skill." 800? Laughed Corporal Rodriguez, the youngest member of the team. "Remember that shot you made in Afghanistan? Had to be over 1,000 meters easy." Chen shrugged with false modesty. 1,120 meters actually, but who's counting? He looked directly at Sarah as he said this, clearly expecting some kind of impressed reaction. Sarah finished reassembling his rifle and held it up to check the action. The bolt cycled smoothly, and she nodded with satisfaction. All set, she said, extending the weapon toward him. The trigger pull is exactly where you specified, and I replaced the firing pin spring as a precaution. Chen took the rifle and immediately began inspecting her work, running his hands over every surface as if looking for flaws. It was a ritual he performed every time, and Sarah had long since stopped taking it personally. "You know what your problem is?" Chen said, apparently finding nothing wrong with the rifle. "You understand these weapons mechanically, but you don't understand them spiritually. A rifle isn't just metal and springs. It's an extension of the shooter's will. It's about the connection between the marksman and his target." Sarah finally looked up from her workbench, meeting his gaze directly. "Is that so?" "Absolutely. Take long-range shooting, for instance. At 1,000 meters, you're not just dealing with ballistics. You've got wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the earth. You need to understand all of that instinctively. Feel it in your bones. It's not something you can learn from a manual." The other team members nodded in agreement, clearly having heard this philosophy many times before. Sarah considered Chen's words for a moment, then returned to organizing her tools. "I'm sure you're right," she said simply. But Chen wasn't finished. He had worked himself up to one of his favorite topics, and the presence of an audience encouraged him to continue. "The longest confirmed kill shot in military history is over 2 miles. Can you even imagine that? The bullet takes several seconds just to reach the target. The shooter has to account for so many variables that most people's heads would spin." 2 miles, echoed Williams appreciatively. "That's like shooting from one end of town to the other." "Exactly," Chen continued, "and that's why I always tell people that there's a difference between knowing about guns and knowing guns. Anyone can learn to field strip a rifle or adjust a scope. But putting steel on target when lives are on the line? That's a gift. It's something you're born with." Sarah had heard enough. She set down the cleaning rod she had been holding and looked at Chen with an expression that was hard to read. "You really believe that? That marksmanship is some kind of mystical talent that can't be taught?" Chen sensed a challenge in her tone and straightened up slightly. "I believe that some people have it and some people don't. I've seen plenty of soldiers who could memorize every ballistics table ever written, but when it came time to make the shot, they just didn't have what it takes. And you think I'm one of those people?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Chen realized he had perhaps pushed things further than he intended, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "I think you're very good at what you do," he said carefully. "But what you do and what we do are completely different things." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering this. Around the armory, the normal sounds of the base continued. Distant gunfire, vehicles moving, soldiers calling to each other across the training areas. But in the small space around her workbench, everything had gone quiet. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose there's only one way to find out for sure." The challenge was arranged for the following Saturday. Word had spread quickly through the base, as news of unusual events always did in military communities. By Friday afternoon, Sarah had received visits from dozens of soldiers, some offering encouragement, others placing informal bets on the outcome. Chen had initially tried to suggest they use the standard 1,000-meter range, but Sarah had surprised everyone by requesting access to the extended range facility. This was a specialized area used only for extreme long-range training, with targets positioned at distances up to 4,000 meters across a valley that stretched between 2 ridges. "You sure about this?" Chen had asked when she made the request. "I was thinking we'd start with something reasonable, maybe 600 meters? "I thought you said anyone could shoot 600 meters, Sarah had replied. "Besides, didn't you mention that record shot was over 2 miles? This range only goes to about 2.5 miles. Should be perfect for someone with your experience." Chen found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his own words used against him. He couldn't back down without losing face, especially since half the base was now aware of the competition. Sarah spent Friday evening in preparation, but not in the way most people expected. While Chen and his team were at the range practicing, she was in the base library, reading meteorology reports and studying topographical maps of the extended range area. She checked historical weather patterns for the region and made careful notes about typical wind conditions at different times of day. Her grandfather had taught her that shooting was 10% equipment, 20% skill, and 70% preparation. "The rifle doesn't miss," he used to say. "The shooter misses. And the shooter misses because he doesn't know what the bullet is going to encounter on its way to the target." Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. The sky was clear, with light winds that would favor long-range shooting. Sarah arrived at the extended range facility at dawn, 2 hours before the scheduled competition. She wanted time to observe the conditions and make her preparations without an audience. The range officer was Sergeant Major Brooks, a grizzled veteran who had overseen thousands of qualification shoots during his career. He was known for his fairness and attention to detail, which was why both sides had agreed to have him officiate the competition. "Morning, Martinez," he said as Sarah signed in. "You sure you know what you're getting into here? Chen's team has been using this range for years. They know every wind pattern and temperature gradient in this valley." Sarah smiled and shouldered her gear bag. "I appreciate the concern, Sergeant Major, but I think I'll be fine." She had chosen to use a rifle from the base inventory rather than borrowing one of the specialized sniper weapons. It was a standard-issue precision rifle that she had personally maintained and knew inside and out. Some might have seen this as a disadvantage, but Sarah preferred working with equipment she understood completely. As the morning progressed, soldiers began arriving to watch the competition. By 10 o'clock, when the shooting was scheduled to begin, nearly 200 people had gathered at the observation area. Someone had even brought a portable grill and was selling breakfast sandwiches. Chen arrived with his usual confidence, accompanied by his team and several other supporters. He was carrying his personal rifle, a custom weapon worth more than most people's cars. The scope alone cost more than Sarah made in a month. "Quite a turnout," he commented to Sarah as they prepared their equipment. "I hope you're not the type to get nervous in front of crowds." "I'll manage," Sarah replied, methodically checking her rifle and ammunition. Sergeant Major Brooks called both shooters together to go over the rules. Each would fire 3 shots at a target positioned at exactly 3,800 meters. The targets were standard military silhouettes with scoring rings. Best average score would win. "Weather conditions are ideal," Brooks announced. "Wind is currently 3 to 5 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity is at 38%. Any questions?" Chen shook his head confidently. Sarah asked about the exact elevation difference between the shooting position and the target, a detail that Chen seemed to consider unnecessary. They drew lots to determine shooting order, and Chen won the right to go first. He spent several minutes setting up his position, adjusting his bipod and checking his scope settings. The crowd fell silent as he settled behind his rifle. His first shot was impressive, striking the target just outside the center ring. The spotting scope confirmed a hit that would have been lethal in combat. A cheer went up from his supporters. His second shot was even better, finding the center ring for maximum points. Chen was clearly in his element, completely comfortable with the pressure and the distance. His third shot was slightly off, back to the second ring, but still an excellent group overall. When the spotting was complete, his average score was announced as 91 out of a possible 100 points. It was a performance that would have been respectable in formal competition. Chen stood and accepted congratulations from his team, clearly pleased with his shooting. "Your turn," he said to Sarah with a confident smile. "Don't worry if you can't match that. This distance takes some getting used to." Sarah took her position without fanfare. She had been watching Chen's shots carefully, noting how the wind had affected each bullet's flight path. Her grandfather had taught her that the best intelligence often came from watching other people shoot first. She made several adjustments to her scope, compensating for the distance and the environmental conditions she had observed. The crowd grew quiet again as she settled into her shooting position. Her first shot seemed to take forever to reach the target. At 3,800 meters, the bullet flight time was over 4 seconds. When the spotting scope operator confirmed the hit, there was a moment of stunned silence. "Center ring," Sergeant Major Brooks announced. "Perfect score on shot 1. The crowd erupted in surprised cheers and applause. Chen's confident expression faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. One good shot could be luck. Sarah's second shot was even more impressive. Not only did it hit the center ring again, but according to the spotter, it appeared to have passed through nearly the same hole as her first shot. "Another center ring," Brooks announced, his voice betraying a hint of amazement. "That's 2 perfect shots." The crowd was now completely focused on Sarah. Even Chen's supporters had stopped their conversations to watch. This was not what anyone had expected. Sarah took her time preparing for the third shot. She could feel the pressure of 200 pairs of eyes watching her, but it felt familiar rather than intimidating. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot in competitions from the time she was 12 years old, and crowds had never bothered her. She breathed steadily, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat and timing her shot for the natural pause between breaths. The rifle recoiled smoothly, and she maintained her sight picture until the bullet impact. 4 seconds later, the spotter called out the result that left everyone speechless. "Center ring again. All 3 shots appear to be through the same hole." Sergeant Major Brooks walked to the spotting scope to confirm what he had heard. After a long moment, he stood up and faced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been running rifle ranges for 26 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Martinez has just fired a perfect group at 3,800 meters. All 3 shots center ring, with a group size of less than 2 inches. The crowd exploded in cheers and applause. Soldiers who had never spoken to Sarah before were congratulating her and slapping her on the back. Someone started chanting her name, and soon the entire crowd had joined in. Chen stood frozen, staring at the target through his binoculars as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His perfect score of 91 points had just been beaten by a perfect score of 100 points, achieved by someone he had dismissed as just a mechanic. But Sarah's day wasn't over yet. As the celebration continued around her, she quietly approached Sergeant Major Brooks with an unusual request. "Sergeant Major," she said, "I'd like to take one more shot, if that's allowed. Not as part of the competition, just for my own satisfaction." Brooks looked puzzled. "You just shot a perfect group, Martinez. What more could you want?" Sarah smiled and pointed to a target that had been set up even further down the range. "That one's at 4,000 meters, isn't it? I've always wondered if I could reach it." The crowd overheard her request, and the cheering gradually died down as people realized what she was proposing. 4,000 meters was beyond the effective range of most military rifles. It was a distance where bullets began to lose significant energy, and accuracy became more a matter of luck than skill. Chen had recovered enough to overhear the conversation, and his competitive nature immediately kicked in. "Now you're talking about a real challenge," he said, forcing a smile. 4,000 meters is a different game entirely. The bullet drop alone is over 200 inches. "I know," Sarah replied. "I calculated it last night." She began making major adjustments to her scope, dialing in the extreme elevation needed for such a long shot. The crowd watched in fascination as she prepared for what many considered an impossible attempt. What happened next would become legend on Fort Braxton, talked about in barracks and mess halls for years to come. The silence that fell over the crowd was different this time. There was an almost reverent quality to it, as if everyone present understood they might be witnessing something historic. Even the base's normal background noise seemed muted, as if the entire installation was holding its breath. Sarah took longer to prepare this shot than she had for any of the others. She consulted a small notebook filled with calculations she had made the night before, adjusting her scope elevation in precise increments. The mathematics involved were staggering. At 4,000 meters, she would need to aim nearly 20 feet above her intended target to compensate for bullet drop. Sergeant Major Brooks positioned himself at the most powerful spotting scope available, while other soldiers with binoculars spread out along the observation line. The target at 4,000 meters was barely visible, even with optical assistance, appearing as little more than a dark speck against the distant hillside. Chen watched Sarah's preparations with growing unease. He had dismissed her earlier success as beginner's luck, but her methodical approach and obvious understanding of the physics involved were impossible to ignore. This wasn't someone stumbling into good shooting. This was someone who had clearly studied the science of ballistics as thoroughly as any professional marksman. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly as Sarah settled into her final shooting position. "You've already proven your point. Nobody's going to think less of you if you walk away now." Sarah looked up at him with an expression that was both amused and determined. "I'm not doing this to prove a point to anyone else," she said. "I'm doing it because I want to see if I can." She returned her attention to the rifle, making final adjustments to her position. The bipod legs were extended to their maximum length, and she had placed a small sandbag under the stock to achieve the precise angle needed for such an extreme shot. Her breathing became slow and deliberate as she settled behind the scope. At 4,000 meters, even the smallest movement would be magnified enormously. A tremor that might not affect accuracy at shorter ranges could send a bullet several feet off target at this distance. The wind had picked up slightly since her earlier shots, adding another variable to an already complex equation. Sarah spent several seconds observing the grass and vegetation between her position and the target, reading the patterns that would tell her how the air was moving at different points along the bullet's path. Finally, she was ready. Her finger found the trigger, and she began the careful process of applying pressure while maintaining perfect sight alignment. The crowd around her seemed to fade away as her entire world narrowed to the crosshairs in her scope and the tiny target in the distance. The rifle fired with its familiar sharp crack, and the bullet began its journey across the valley. At 4,000 meters, the flight time was over 5 seconds. An eternity in shooting terms. Sarah maintained her position, watching through her scope as the bullet arced across the intervening space. For those 5 seconds, the entire range was silent, except for the distant echo of the gunshot rolling back from the hills. 200 soldiers stood motionless, many holding their breath without realizing it. Then Sergeant Major Brooks's voice cut through the silence. "Hit." The word was spoken quietly, almost disbelievingly, but in the perfect silence it carried to every person present. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Brooks spoke again, his voice stronger and filled with amazement. "Direct hit, center mass. I don't believe what I'm seeing, but it's a confirmed hit at 4,000 meters. The explosion of sound from the crowd was unlike anything the range had ever heard. Soldiers were cheering, whistling, and applauding with an enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Someone was shouting, "Holy shit," repeatedly, apparently unable to express himself any other way. Sarah remained in her shooting position for a few more seconds, as if she needed time to process what had just happened. When she finally sat up and safed her rifle, she found herself surrounded by a crowd of soldiers, all trying to congratulate her at once. Chen stood apart from the celebration, staring at the distant target through his binoculars. He had spent years training to become one of the military's elite marksmen, and he had just watched a civilian contractor make a shot that few people in the world could accomplish. Sergeant Major Brooks was on the radio, calling down to the target area to confirm what his spotting scope had shown. When he finished the conversation, he turned to face the crowd with an expression of pure amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received confirmation from the target area. Martinez's bullet struck the target dead center with an impact energy sufficient to have been a lethal hit in combat. As far as I know, this is the longest successful shot ever recorded on this range. The celebration continued for several more minutes before gradually beginning to wind down. Soldiers started drifting away in small groups, already planning how they would describe what they had witnessed to friends who hadn't been there. Chen finally approached Sarah as she was packing her equipment. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by what looked like genuine respect mixed with confusion. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Where did you learn to shoot like that? I mean, really learn. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't beginner's skill. That was world-class marksmanship." Sarah finished placing her rifle in its case before answering. "My grandfather," she said simply. "He taught me that shooting isn't about mystical connections or natural talent. It's about understanding physics, reading conditions, and practicing until you can do everything perfectly every time." "But the calculations alone," Chen shook his head. "The math required for a 4,000-meter shot is graduate-level ballistics." "I have a degree in mechanical engineering," Sarah replied. "I minored in mathematics. When you understand how bullets fly and why they go where they go, shooting becomes much less mysterious." Chen was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this information. "Why didn't you ever mention that before? I mean, you all assumed I was just a mechanic who happened to work on guns," Sarah finished. "And you were right. That is what I am. But being a mechanic doesn't mean being ignorant, and working on weapons doesn't mean not understanding how to use them." As they walked back toward the main base, Chen seemed to be struggling with something. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong, and I was condescending and disrespectful. That shot you just made, hell, those shots you made, I couldn't do that on my best day." Sarah appreciated the apology, but she wasn't interested in making Chen feel worse than he already did. "You're a good shooter," she said. "Your group at 3,800 meters was genuinely impressive. You just made the mistake of thinking that shooting skill can only come from one kind of background." "So what happens now?" Chen asked. "I mean, after today, everyone on base is going to know what you can do. Are you going to keep fixing rifles, or are you thinking about putting in for a transfer to a shooting unit?" Sarah smiled at the question. "I'm going to keep fixing rifles," she said. "I love my job. I love understanding how these weapons work and making sure they work perfectly for the people who depend on them. Today wasn't about changing careers. It was just about proving a point." "What point?" "That respect should be based on what people can actually do, not on assumptions about what they should be able to do." Word of Sarah's shooting spread far beyond Fort Braxton. Within a week, she had received calls from military units, competitive shooting organizations, and even television shows wanting to interview her or invite her to participate in various events. She turned down most of these opportunities, preferring to return to her normal routine in the armory. However, she did notice some changes in how she was treated on base. Soldiers who brought weapons to her for maintenance now often lingered to ask technical questions about ballistics or shooting technique. Her expertise was finally being recognized and appreciated. Chen and his team became regular visitors to the armory, but now they came as much to learn as to have their weapons serviced. Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial consultant on long-range shooting techniques, sharing the mathematical and engineering principles that made extreme accuracy possible. The range record she had set that day stood unchallenged for several years, becoming part of Fort Braxton's unofficial history. New soldiers arriving at the base would inevitably hear the story of the mechanic who had outshot the elite sniper team, usually with embellishments that made the feat even more impressive than it actually was. Sarah kept the small notebook in which she had calculated the ballistics for her record shot. Sometimes, when she was working alone in the armory, she would flip through its pages and remember that perfect morning when everything had come together exactly as she had planned. Her grandfather had been right about preparation being the key to success. But what he hadn't told her was how satisfying it could be to exceed everyone's expectations, including her own. The rifles she maintained continued to perform flawlessly in the hands of the soldiers who carried them, but now everyone understood that the woman who ensured their reliability was far more than just a mechanic. She was a master of her craft in every sense of the word, and she had the target at 4,000 meters to prove it.